already know the picture. You've seen it 100 times without ever being told it was a lie. A dark room, lit orange by the fire. Sparks leaping off the anvil with every swing of the hammer. A blade taking shape under your fists, while a knight waits by the door, purse in hand, ready to pay whatever you ask. Steel, muscle, and money. The oldest cool business in the world. The one that still looks romantic 800 years later, long after the knights are dust, and the swords are behind museum glass. Everybody knows this version. The blacksmith as weapon maker. The forge as the beating heart of a medieval war economy. The smith as a man who got rich turning iron into death. And almost every part of it is wrong. Not wrong the way a small detail is wrong. Wrong the way a decoy is wrong. A shiny distraction placed exactly where your attention naturally goes, so you never look at the thing that actually mattered. Because if you want to understand whether owning a medieval blacksmith shop made you a wealthy man or quietly destroyed you, you have to forget the sword completely. You have to stop watching the hammer. And you have to do the one thing the romantic version never lets you do. You have to look at the accounts. So let's look at one. In the year 1409, an English manor called East Mayon needed its ploughs kept in working iron for the season. Someone in that estate's counting house wrote down what it cost, line by line, the way estates did, because someone always had to answer for the money. And the numbers they left behind quietly demolish everything the movies taught you. The manor paid 22 shillings for the iron and steel that went into those ploughs. The smith who forged all of it, every share, every coulter, every fitting, every reheating and hammering and welding, was paid 8 shillings for the year's labour. Read that again slowly, because this is the whole story in 2 numbers. Nearly 3/4 of the bill was metal. The man's skill, his sweat, his 7 years of training, his entire craft, accounted for barely 1/4. The iron was worth 3 times the artist, and that single ratio decides everything. It means the question that determines whether you get rich in this trade was never how good are you with a hammer. A dozen men in that county could swing a hammer. The question, the only question that matters, is this: who buys the iron? Get that answer right, and skill turns into wealth. Get it wrong, and your talent spends its entire life working for someone else's ledger. You'll sweat, you'll master your craft, you'll go home tired and proud, and you'll be poor because 3/4 of the value that passed through your hands was never yours to keep. The hammer was never the business, the contract was. Now let's prove it. Because I'm not going to ask you to take a 2-line manor account on faith. I'm going to build you a real blacksmith shop from documented prices, put you behind the anvil in the year 1410, and walk you through every shilling, what it costs to open the doors, where the money actually comes from, and the single clause that separated the comfortable smiths from the ruined ones. By the end, you'll have something no romantic legend ever gives you: the real ledger. And the very first thing that ledger does is kill the sword. Here's what the legend never mentions. In a real English town around 1410, the sword isn't even yours to make. Weapons and armor belong to entirely different men, guarded by entirely different trades, and they will fight you for touching their work. Armorers make the plate, bladesmiths make the blades. Cutlers finish the knives, spurriers forge the spurs, and in the bigger cities, these trades guard their territory so aggressively that the blacksmith's own company records are stuffed with border disputes, professional turf wars over who is allowed to hammer what. A knight who wants a sword is not riding to your village. He's riding past it, on his way to a specialist in a city, and he wouldn't glance twice at your shop. So who does stop? The farmer whose ploughshare just cracked on frozen ground and who cannot plant a field until it's fixed. The carter who needs a fresh iron tire fitted to his wheel before market day, or he doesn't sell. The miller bleeding money every single hour his millstones sit dull and his mill sits silent. The builders buying nails by the 100, plus hinges and bars and locks. The households wanting fire tongs, hooks, a cauldron mended. And the travellers whose horses throw a shoe on the road, which is the exact reason your shop sits where it sits. We know where it sits, by the way, because archaeologists dug one up. At a place called Chively, they found a village smithy, and its location gives away the entire strategy. The forge stood at the edge of the settlement, right beside the road running into the high street. Far enough out that the smoke, the noise, and the constant fire risk stayed clear of the neighbors. Close enough that every single horse and cart entering that town had to pass your open door. The medieval blacksmith understood location the way a modern gas station owner does. You don't build where it's pretty, you build where the traffic can't avoid you. None of these customers is glamorous. Not one of them is a knight. And together they are worth vastly more than any sword, for a reason the legend actively hides from you. But before you spend a single coin, we need to clear up the thing every movie gets catastrophically wrong, because it changes what business you're actually in. You do not melt iron. You do not pour glowing metal into molds like some medieval foundry. Smelting ore into metal happens somewhere else entirely. A different industry, in a different place, run by different people. What arrives at your shop is solid bar iron, already made. Your entire trade is this. You heat that solid metal until it glows, and then you hit it. You bend it, punch it, weld it, and force it into shape. Your whole craft is making solid iron move. That sounds like a technicality. It isn't. It's the foundation of your entire financial life, because it means you don't control where your raw material comes from or what it costs. And we'll see exactly how lethal that becomes. Now look around this town one more time, but look at it the way an accountant would. Every plough in the fields, every cart on the road, every mill, every door, every roof in sight. What are they made of? Wood. All of it. This is a wooden world, and every one of those wooden things wears out, breaks, cracks, or falls apart, at exactly the points where iron holds them together. The plough is wood, but the share that cuts the earth is iron, and the earth destroys it. The cart is wood, but the tire that meets the road is iron, and the road grinds it down. The mill is timber and stone, but the bearings and bands and sharpening bills are iron, and they fail on schedule. The wooden world cannot move, cannot farm, cannot grind grain, cannot travel, without iron. And iron always wears out. That detail is worth more than every sword ever forged. Sit with it, because it flips the entire romance on its head. A sword might bring you prestige exactly once. You forge it, it's admired, the customer leaves, and the transaction is over. But a plowshare? A plowshare brings that same farmer back to your door every year of his working life, because every furrow he cuts drags iron through dirt and stone, and the ground always wins eventually. The horse comes back because it always needs shoes. The mill comes back because the stones always go dull. The cart comes back because the road never stops eating the tire. This is the secret the legend was built to hide. The medieval blacksmith shop was never the town's weapon store. It was the maintenance department for an entire civilization made of wood. Part supplier, part roadside service station, part scrapyard, all under one smoky roof. Its job was to keep every plough, cart, and mill within walking distance running on schedule, forever. The glamorous work, the sword, the blade, the shining plate, belonged to other men in other towns. The profitable work was unglamorous, repetitive, and endless. Where was your salesman? And he never slept. Which brings us to the uncomfortable question hiding underneath all of it. If the demand never stops, if iron always breaks, if the customers always come back, if the whole wooden world depends on you, then owning this shop should have been a license to print money. Recurring revenue, structural demand, a subscription business 400 years before anyone invented the word. So why does the record keep showing us smiths who ended in ruin? Because two men could do identical work, in identical towns, with identical skill and identical sweat. And one built a comfortable life, while the other lost everything down to his last pair of tongs. Same hammer, same fire, same customers coming through the same door. And the difference between them came down to a single line in a single agreement. Not talent, not effort, not luck with the customers. One clause, one question, asked before the fire was ever lit. Who buys the iron? Remember East Meon, 22 shillings of metal sitting across the table from 8 shillings of skill. In that account, whoever carried the metal side of the deal carried 3/4 of the entire risk. Because when iron prices moved, and they moved violently, that side of the table bled. The romantic story wants you to believe a blacksmith's fortune was decided at the anvil, in the heat and the sparks, by the quality of his craft. The documents say something colder. His fortune was decided in advance, on parchment, in the wording of a contract most people never read. The difference between a smith who sold his skill and a smith who, without ever realizing it, had signed up to gamble on the price of iron for a full year with the odds locked before the game began. So before we spend a single coin opening these doors, hold on to the two numbers that started all of this. 22 shillings of iron, 8 shillings of a man, and everything depended on which side of that ledger carried your name. Now let's find out what it actually costs to walk in. Every legend about getting rich glosses over one detail: the price of walking in. Pricing a medieval startup is usually pure guesswork. Historians shrug, throw out a range, move on. This time, we got lucky. A real man's shop was inventoried, item by item, coin by coin, and the reason he left us that gift is not a happy one. In 1454, London officials walked into a workshop belonging to a craftsman named Richard Cripps and wrote down the value of everything he owned. Not because he was proud of it, because he owed money, and someone needed to know exactly what could be seized to cover the debt. Cripps was technically a wheelwright, not a blacksmith, but he ran a full working forge inside his shop, the way many wood and metal trades did, and his inventory is the best surviving price list we have for exactly the kind of shop you're about to open. So we're going to build your smithy out of a dead man's repossession. Start with the metal shaping core, the tools that actually turn iron into something useful. 9 pairs of tongs for gripping hot metal at every angle a job demands. A pair of pincers, 7 hammers, each suited to a different weight of blow, a bicorn and a pointed mini anvil for curved work, and the centerpiece of the whole operation, a proper anvil weighing 114 pounds. Together, the officials valued this entire set, tongs, hammers, bicorn, anvil, all of it, at 10 shillings and sixpence. Here's the number that should surprise you. It isn't the anvil that costs the most, it's the bellows. 2 big leather lungs, built to feed air into your fire, cost 6 shillings and 8pence on their own, 2/3 of the price of the entire hammer and anvil set combined, just to make the fire breathe. And there's no way around this cost, no cheaper substitute, because without bellows, the hearth never gets hot enough to work iron at all. Nobody in this trade skips this line, no matter how tight the budget. You can improvise with fewer hammers. You cannot improvise oxygen. Keep going down Cripps' list, and the pattern of small things adding up continues. 7 files cost 5 pence. A hearth shovel costs 4 pence. A grindstone complete with its trough, for sharpening and finishing work, costs 4 shillings. Stocks and a water trough add another shilling. Total up every one of these movable tools, and you land at 22 shillings and 11 pence to equip the actual craft. Then comes the strangest line item on the entire inventory, and the one that tells you the most about how this business really worked. Cripps was holding over 100 weight of old iron, broken fittings, worn-out horseshoes, scrap metal collected over who knows how many repair jobs. The officials valued it at 9 shillings and 2 pence. New iron in the shop, purchased fresh from a merchant? None. 0. Sit with that. With nearly 1/3 of the entire movable value sitting in this working forge was, quite literally, other people's garbage. Broken hinges nobody wanted back, snapped horseshoes pulled off a lame horse. This wasn't waste sitting in a corner, it was inventory. Every scrap that walked in attached to a repair job and walked out as raw material for the next one, never once passing through a merchant's hands, never once costing you a shilling to acquire. We'll come back to exactly how valuable that pile becomes. For now, just notice it's there, worth more than the anvil. Add the costs a tool inventory doesn't capture, a year's rent for a craftsman's shophouse. The historian Christopher Dyer's benchmark puts a figure like that around 20 shillings. Allow for your first delivery of fuel, since the fire has to be lit before a single customer arrives. And set aside enough cash to survive the slow payers every tradesman deals with, the farmer who promises payment after harvest, and means it eventually. Add it all together, tools, scrap stock, rent, fuel, a cash cushion, and your bare opening bill lands somewhere between £2, 12 shillings and £4. That's a reconstruction built entirely from documented prices, not invention. And it comes with one honest caveat: buy everything new instead of working from a seized man's leftovers, Or aim to open bigger than a single hearth village shop, and the bill multiplies fast. A Paris armourer's anvil and bellows alone were valued at 60 shillings back in 1302, 6 times what Cripp's entire toolkit cost. The Royal Armoury built at Greenwich, roughly a century after your shop opens, spent nearly £14 on tools alone. Scale changes everything, and it changes it upward, steeply. Numbers like £2 to £4 mean nothing floating on their own. You need to weigh them against something real, against what a working man in this trade actually earned. London fixed a journeyman blacksmith's pay at 40 shillings a year in the 1450s. That's £2, paid in cash. No meals included, no lodging thrown in, just the bare wage for a trained man's labour. Now put the two numbers side by side. Opening the cheapest version of this shop cost somewhere between 1 and 2 full years of a working smith's entire income. Everything he would earn, every single shilling, for 1 to 2 years. Gone before the fire is even lit, before a single customer walks through the door, before you've forged one nail. That is steep. Make no mistake about that. But it is reachable, and compared to plenty of other medieval trades requiring specialized stock or import licenses, it's actually on the affordable end. This is not a business reserved for the wealthy. A disciplined smith, or a smith with a little family capital behind him, could plausibly claw his way to that opening sum. The door was not locked, it was just expensive, and it demanded that you survive on savings, credit, or someone else's goodwill for a year or two before the shop paid you back a single coin of profit. And here is the detail worth returning to, because it undoes the entire romantic myth all over again. The anvil, the object every legend puts at the center of the story, the thing every illustration shows glowing under a blacksmith's hammer, was never the expensive part. It cost 10 shillings and sixpence for the whole toolkit, including the anvil. The bellows alone nearly matched that. The scrap pile nearly matched that. Rent for the year, on its own, doubled it. The mythology fixates on the one object that mattered least to your balance sheet. This is the pattern you're going to see again and again as we open this ledger further. The parts of the blacksmith's life that look cinematic, the ringing hammer, the glowing anvil, the sparks, are cheap and almost incidental. The parts that actually decide whether you live or starve are boring. Bellows, scrap iron, rent. A dead wheelwright's repossessed toolkit, priced out by officials who were, ironically, doing exactly the kind of financial accounting that the legend never lets you see. So you've paid your 1 to 2 years of wages just to open the door. The tools are hung on the wall, the bellows are ready to breathe, the scrap pile is waiting to be reheated. The hearth is cold, but it's yours. Now you need hands. Because here is a fact the legend never mentions either. You cannot run this shop alone. Not for a week. And the moment you try, the arithmetic of a one-man forge is going to teach you, fast and expensively, exactly why every real medieval smithy was a household. Not a solitary craftsman with a hammer, but a small interlocking operation of wages, food, contracts, and unpaid family labor, every part of it a financial decision disguised as a domestic one. Try running this shop alone for a single week, and the problem finds you fast. The bellows must be pumped continuously while the iron heats. Stop pumping, the fire cools, the metal stiffens, the job stalls. Heavy work needs one person gripping the tongs and a second swinging the sledge at the same moment in rhythm, or the piece is ruined. Out front, a farmer is waiting to be served while the fire in back is demanding attention it isn't getting. And somewhere in the middle of all that, you're supposed to be chasing down the customers who haven't paid you since spring. You have 2 hands. This shop needs 6. That gap is not a minor inconvenience. It's the first real financial decision you have to make, and it comes with 2 very different price tags. Option 1. Hire a journeyman. A journeyman is a trained smith working for wages, a man who already knows the craft and needs no teaching, just a wage and direction. That standard 40-shilling annual wage buys you real, immediate skill from day one. London's guild rules in 1434 even built a trial period into the arrangement. A stranger had to prove his competence for 2 weeks before a master could formally take him on for a 3-year term. It's a serious commitment on both sides, and an expensive one. But the journeyman is free to walk the moment his term ends. taking his trained hands with him to whoever offers a better wage next. Option 2 looks like the obvious bargain, and almost everyone gets it wrong. Take an apprentice instead. Free labor, right? A boy bound to you for 7 years, working for nothing. Except the apprentice lives in your house. You feed him, you clothe him, you lodge him. For 7 years. And while he's learning, which is most of those 7 years, he's burning your charcoal, ruining your iron, practicing techniques he hasn't mastered yet, and eating a full share of food, whether the shop earned a single shilling that week or not. A study of 82 surviving medieval apprenticeship contracts estimated the full 7-year cost of keeping one apprentice at somewhere between £12 and £39, with food consistently the biggest line item. That range spans many different crafts, not smiths alone, so treat it as an approximation, but even the low end works out to nearly £2 a year. Compare that to the £2 journeyman's wage, and in any single year, the trained journeyman is actually cheaper per unit of useful work. The free apprentice was never free. He was a deferred compounding bill disguised as a bargain. The masters of the trade knew this perfectly well, and the guild's own fines prove it. In London, poaching another master's journeyman, luring away his trained, wage-earning smith, cost you a fine of 6 shillings and 8 pence. Poaching his apprentice cost 20 shillings, 3 times as much. Why would an unfinished boy be worth more to protect than a fully trained man? Because by year 5 of his 7, that apprentice had become a trained striker, locked into a contract at a fraction of market wages, and every master in the trade knew exactly what those years of feeding him had cost to produce. The high fine wasn't protecting a person, it was protecting an investment. Records from Romney in 1451 give us a glimpse of what the apprentice himself actually received for all this. Smith's apprentices earning a penny a week. One of them had 20 shillings promised on completion of his term. Deferred pay, with dinner included in the meantime. Apprenticeship, in other words, didn't make labor free. It converted a wage into a 7-year food bill, and it bound the boy to your shop so tightly he couldn't simply leave for better pay elsewhere, the way a journeyman could. There's a third source of labor the legend never mentions at all, and it's arguably the most important one: your own household. This was never a one-man operation with a boy sweeping the floor. It was a family business, and the family worked. Wives and children routinely handled cold work, finishing, filing, selling finished goods to customers at the counter while the master stayed at the fire. This wasn't informal or unofficial either. The London Smiths Fraternity of 1434 formally included sisters in its membership rolls, and 2 of the members who signed the guild's own rules were Smiths' wives, not Smiths themselves. And when the King's own forge at the Tower of London needed running in 1346, the job went to a woman, Catherine Lefebvre, who ran royal smithing operations while her son was away serving abroad. Not a symbolic appointment, she ran a royal forge, so your real crew, once it's assembled, looks like this. One master at the anvil, one late-term apprentice who's finally becoming useful after years of costing you money, and a household working behind and around both of you, unpaid, unrecorded in most account books, and absolutely essential to the shop staying open. Now that you have hands, everything depends on what comes through the door to keep them busy. And before customers, there's metal. Because bar iron does not grow in your yard, and where it comes from turns out to be one of the most dangerous exposures in this entire business. Iron comes from smelting districts, places like the Forest of Dean, or the Weald down in Kent and Sussex. And from there it passes through merchants and travels by cart to reach your market town shop. Between the mine and your hearth sit at least 2 middlemen, a cart journey over bad roads, and a chain of merchant credit. Which means the price you pay for the single most important input in your entire business rises and falls with wars you didn't start, road conditions you don't control, and rumors you can't verify. You are, whether you ever think of it this way or not, exposed to a commodity market every single time you restock, and that exposure becomes lethal the moment the iron supply breaks. Steel is a different substance entirely, and a smith treats it like a spice merchant treats saffron. Bought in small pieces, never wasted on the body of anything. Archaeologists who cut open medieval knives recovered from Ancient Abbey found the trick laid bare in cross-section, a thin steel edge fire-welded onto a cheaper, tougher iron back. The steel holds the hard cutting edge, the iron backing bends without snapping under stress. It's an engineering compromise built entirely around cost, and it's exactly why the East Meon accounts bundle iron and steel together in a single line on the plough bill. Steel goes only on the wearing edge. Iron does everything else. Fuel is the third input, and unlike iron, it's one you burn whether the job pays or not. A rural forge like yours runs on charcoal. In London, city smiths burned sea coal instead. We know that detail specifically because a London forge's coal smoke ended up at the centre of a lawsuit. Every reheating of a piece costs fuel, which means a slow-paying customer doesn't just delay your revenue, it actively costs you money in the meantime, because every extra trip his stubborn job takes back to the fire eats stock you already paid for out of your own pocket. Now, about that strange pile of old iron sitting in Richard Cripp's inventory. Here's exactly how it accumulates. A farmer brings you a snapped hinge. You forge weld it back together, hand it over, collect your fee. Simple, ordinary repair work. But say instead he wants a brand new hinge rather than a repaired one. And now a quiet, almost invisible question decides your margin on every single job like it for the rest of your career. Does the broken one go home with him or into your pile? Old shoes, worn fittings, snapped straps. Every discarded piece is future stock that you never paid a merchant a single shilling to acquire. No surviving document tells us who kept the scrap by default. The answer may well have been negotiated case by case, job by job, a quiet little negotiation invisible to everyone but the smith and his customer. But keeping it costs you nothing, and its value compounds with every repair that walks through your door. That broken horseshoe sitting in the corner wasn't waste. It was inventory waiting patiently to be reheated. All of this, the labor question, the iron pipeline, the scrap pile, feeds into the one question that actually decides what kind of business you're running. What does this shop really sell? The sword has already disappeared from the ledger for good. What replaces it is a structure of revenue with rungs, from cheap and steady at the bottom to rare and precious at the top. And understanding those rungs is what finally lets us climb toward the number everyone actually wants to know. Climb the revenue ladder from the bottom, because that's where the real business actually lives. The ground floor is volume hardware, nails by the hundred for builders, hooks, latches, buckles, straps. Each individual job pays only a few coins. It's not glamorous, and it never will be. But demand is constant. The work is simple enough to hand to an apprentice as practice, and it keeps cash moving through the shop on the slowest weeks. This is the floor everything else stands on. One rung up sits shoeing. The East Meon accounts show the manor paying 6 shillings to keep 3 cart horses shod for an entire year. That works out to 2 shillings per horse per year. And horses never stop needing shoes. This isn't a sale, it's a subscription, 400 years before anyone invented the word for it, recurring, predictable, and tied to a living animal that will keep wearing down iron on a schedule nature sets. Not you. Higher still is plough iron, and the Morden accounts near London give us actual prices. A new ploughshare costs 10 pence. Shoeing the front feet of 2 draft horses costs 4 pence. Every furrow a farmer cuts drags iron through dirt and stone, and the ground always wins eventually. Season after season, the same plough teams come back through the same door, because the earth never stops fighting the iron that cuts it. Near the top of the ladder sits the miller, and the miller buys something different from everyone below him. Morden's records show mill bill sharpening, spindle iron, and bands for the cogwheel appearing as steady line items, year after year, without fail. What the miller is actually purchasing from you isn't metal, it's time. Dull millstones mean days of lost grinding, and every hour his mill sits idle costs him far more money than your fee ever will. Those same Morden accounts even include 2 pence for mending a church window bar, because in this town, when anything made of iron fails, from God's own house on down to the humblest cart, it fails toward you. There's nowhere else for it to go. Step back and look at the pattern running through every single rung of this ladder. In almost every case, the customer already owns the object. You're repairing it, sharpening it, refitting it, not building it from scratch. That distinction matters more than it sounds like it should, because it decides where your profit actually sits. Jobs where the material is mostly his and the margin is mostly yours, are the good jobs. New-made goods carry your entire iron bill folded invisibly into the price you quote. Repairs barely do. The unglamorous work, the hinge, the shoe, the sharpened blade, is, quietly, the profitable work. And at the very top of this entire ladder sits the prize, an annual agreement that turns a scattered stream of individual jobs into one standing relationship. A manor or a rectory pays you, in advance or on schedule, to keep its ploughs, its tools, and its horses running for an entire year, no matter how many separate repairs that actually requires. The paper trail for this kind of arrangement runs back generations before your shop even opens its doors. Manorial accounts from Cuxham in Oxfordshire, dated all the way back to 1316, show an estate paying its smith in instalments spread across the year. Plough repairs paid one season, shoeing paid the next, everything running on a fixed schedule. A full century before you light your own fire in 1410, English estates had already learned to treat smithing not as a series of one-off purchases, but as a standing service, something closer to what we'd now call a maintenance contract. One fact holds true at every single rung of this ladder, and it's worth saying plainly. The town around you runs on wood, and iron joins that wood everywhere, in carts, in ploughs, in mills, in buildings. It gives tools their cutting edge. It shoes the animals that pull every load. And all of that iron wears out on a schedule you could nearly set a calendar by. Ploughing time, market days, harvest. Where is your salesman? And he never sleeps, never takes a day off, and never stops knocking on your door. With demand this structural and this recurring, the shop looks unsinkable from the outside. This is exactly the point in the story where the myth would end. Steady customers, endless repeat business, a craft the whole town depends on. Roll credits, the smith prospers. Except two smiths, doing genuinely identical work in genuinely identical towns, could be running two completely different businesses. Same hammer, same fire, same customers walking through the same kind of door. And the entire difference between them comes down to one line in one deal. Let's put two real agreements side by side. Both are preserved in manor records. Both cover the same work, keeping an estate's ploughs in iron, and they could not be more different underneath the surface. At East Meon in 1409, the manor buys the metal itself, 22 shillings of iron and steel straight out of its own purse. It then pays you, the smith, an 8-shilling stipend for the year's forging. Your hands are the product, their metal is the risk. If iron prices double tomorrow, it's the manor's ledger that bleeds. Your costs simply don't move. Now look at Morden's 1346 agreement and notice how differently it's built. The manor pays its smith 14 shillings for the year, all in, a single lump sum, to keep 2 ploughs in ironwork. But this time he supplies the metal himself, at a fee that was fixed in advance before he knew what iron would cost him over the coming 12 months. 14 shillings looks like the bigger, better deal sitting next to East Meon's 8. On paper it is, but every single swing in the iron market from that point forward runs straight through his personal ledger, not the manor's, and the account's own editor, examining the surviving document centuries later, warns that the sum likely didn't even cover the smith's true costs once the metal was accounted for. By signing that contract, the Morden smith didn't sell smithing anymore. He started betting on the price of iron for a full year, with the odds locked in before the game had even begun, and no way to walk away from the bet once the ink was dry. These two deals sit 63 years and a full county apart, so they're not a controlled experiment. Nobody ran them side by side deliberately to compare results. What they prove instead is simpler and more important. Both structures existed at the same time, in the same trade, available to the same kind of smith. Same hammer, same skill, same sweat, expended in the same way, on the same kind of iron, for the same kind of estate. One arrangement is a salary with a forge attached. The other is a commodity trade wearing a leather apron. Now the East Meon split finally clicks fully into place. In that account, metal made up 73% of the total plough iron bill. Labor made up 27%. Whoever holds the metal side of a deal is holding 3/4 of the total risk sitting on that table. Not a third, not half, 3/4. Owning this shop successfully was never really about owning a forge. It was about successfully pushing that metal risk side of the table toward your customer, wherever and however you could manage it. When you couldn't manage it, when the contract you signed left the iron price sitting on your own shoulders, you had no choice but to price every job like a merchant instead of a craftsman, calculating risk premiums into a hinge repair the way a grain trader prices a harvest that hasn't come in yet. Around that one central clause, all the smaller levers of the business stack up in support. Keep the scrap, and your material costs fall a little further with every repair. A roadside position brings you walk-in travelers willing to pay premium rates for urgent work. Charge more when the ploughing rush hits and every farmer in the district needs his share fixed yesterday, not next week. Collect payment promptly or insist on materials up front from customers you don't fully trust. Each of these levers nudges your margin a little in your favor, but none of them decide whether you survive. Only the contract does that. And in a bad year, which arrives eventually for everyone in this trade, the contract stops being an abstract clause on parchment and starts being the difference between a rough season and total ruin. In a bad year, the contract you signed stops being a clause on parchment and starts deciding in real time whether your household eats. And trouble has a habit of arriving from directions the contract never even mentioned. Start with the shock of 1348. When the Black Death tore through England, it didn't politely spare the supply chains. Customers died alongside miners and merchants in the same weeks, and the iron supply, already running through at least 2 middlemen and a cart journey, convulsed along with everything else. By 1354, petitioners in London were claiming that bar iron cost 4 times what it had 6 years earlier. That figure comes specifically from the armor market in the middle of a crisis, so treat it as a claim rather than a precisely measured fact. Petitioners in court have reasons to state numbers that favor their case, but the exact multiple matters less than the mechanism underneath it. A price shock like that, landing on a smith locked into a fixed all-in fee, a modern-style contract where he supplies his own metal at a rate agreed a year earlier, doesn't just shrink his margin. It devours it entirely, and then it starts eating into his household's food and rent. Suppose the market itself spares you. Your neighbors might not. In 1377, a London couple named Thomas Young and his wife Alice took an armourer named Stephen at Fryth to court over his forge, and their complaint survives in vivid specific detail. They described a chimney built 12 feet too low against the city's own building customs. They described sledgehammer blows shaking the shared walls of their house at all hours. They described work running day and night, with sea coal smoke drifting straight into their rooms. They alleged the racket and the smoke had cut their property's rental value by 70%. That figure is the plaintiff's own claim, not an independently verified one, and worth flagging as such. Fryth's side responded that the chimney had since been raised and reinforced. Either way, by the time the dust settled, Fryth was paying for masonry repairs and lawyers on top of running his forge. Your trade is fire, smoke, and constant noise, operating inside a town built almost entirely of timber. The neighborhood itself, it turns out, is a cost line on your ledger, one that never shows up until someone drags you to court over it. But debt cut deepest of all, and 2 documented workshops show exactly how fast a life's work could come apart. William Randolph, a London armourer running a serious multi-anvil operation, a real business, not a single struggling hearth, owed £48. When officials came to collect, they seized everything he had. His armour stock, his household goods, his anvils, his bellows, his tongs, his shears. The entire lot, everything he'd built, was valued at £33, 13 shillings, and 11 pence. His whole world, hammers included, covered barely 70% of what he owed. The rest simply vanished into the gap between what he'd built and what he owed, with no further mention in the surviving record of how, or whether, it was ever resolved. And then there's Richard Cripps, the wheelwright whose seized inventory gave us our entire opening price list. Cripps appears in the historical record at all only because he owed a priory £40 against goods that were valued at just 20. Half. His shop, inventoried down to the last file and hearth shovel, was worth half of what he owed the moment the officials walked in the door. Sit with that for a second, because it recontextualizes everything we built earlier. Your opening price list, The very foundation this entire reconstructed shop was built from came from a forge being taken apart. We shopped for our startup tools from a bankruptcy. Drought creates a different kind of trap, one with no villain at all to blame, which somehow makes it worse. Go back to East Meon one final time, this time to 1301, when the manor's own account explains its own numbers in the estate's own words. Plough iron costs surged that year because of what the record calls excessive drought. Baked, hardened ground shatters ploughshares and coulters on contact, so broken iron comes pouring into your shop in volumes you've never seen before. It looks at first glance like an absolute windfall. Every farmer in the district suddenly needs new iron at once, until you remember what drought does to your customers' harvest, and therefore to their purses. The same weather that fills your order book to bursting is, at the very same moment, emptying the pockets that are supposed to pay for it. Your busiest stretch of the entire year can arrive precisely when your customers are at their poorest, leaving you extending credit to half the village at the exact moment you can least afford to wait for payment, with fuel and materials going out the door faster than coin comes back in. There's one honest caveat that has to sit here, right in the middle of all this ruin, because pretending otherwise would be its own kind of myth-making. This channel doesn't invent bankruptcies where none existed. No surviving parchment hands us the clean, complete collapse of one ordinary village smith in the year 1410 specifically. What survives instead are pieces. A forge effectively dismantled and abandoned, its tools scattered into other men's hands. A workshop's goods carried away and inventoried down to the last pair of tongs. A lawsuit over smoke and shaking walls. A workshop valued at exactly half its debts. Assemble those pieces side by side, though, and the shape of failure becomes clear enough to recognize, even if no single document spells it out in full. It just never signs its own name at the bottom of a page. Nobody wrote, "This is how a blacksmith goes broke." They just left behind the receipts, the lawsuits, and the seizure inventories. And centuries later, those documents happen to line up into exactly that story, told sideways through the paperwork of other people's disasters. Which leaves one question still sitting on the table, the same one we opened this entire story with. After the tools, the labor, the ladder of customers, and the ways it all could fall apart, could you personally, standing at that anvil in 1410, have actually gotten rich? Put every number from this entire story onto a single table, and one question remains standing at the end of it. Could you actually get rich? No smith's personal account book survives from this period. Not one from any village forge telling us directly what a working smith actually took home in a real year. So we have to do what the record itself never did for us. We build a year ourselves, calibrated to every receipt you've already seen across this story, and we label it honestly for exactly what it is. A reconstruction, not a discovery. Take a decent year first, not spectacular, just solid. Estate agreements bringing in steady work, repairs and shoeing arriving on schedule, hardware for the builders, jobs from the mill, work from travelers passing through on the road. Call it £14 coming through the door across the whole year. Against that, £5.50 goes out for iron, steel, fuel, and the cart and merchant chain. Nearly £2 goes toward keeping the apprentice fed and clothed. £1 for rent, another £1 for guild dues, toolware, and the debts that, despite your best collection efforts, never quite come home. Left sitting in the cash box at year's end, £4.15. On a shop that cost somewhere between £2.12 and £4 to open, that number looks genuinely magnificent. A single good year nearly repaying your entire startup cost, with change left over. An average year runs quieter, £10.50 comes in instead of 14, and after the lower material and fuel bill that a slower year brings with it, about £2.10 stays with you at the end. But there's one entry still missing from both of these calculations, and the moment you add it in, it quietly kills the celebration. Your own wage. Ask what your two hands, doing this exact work, would have earned if you'd simply gone to work for someone else instead of opening your own shop. 40 shillings, £2 at the fixed London journeyman rate. Subtract the salary you never actually paid yourself, the way any honest ledger has to, because your labor was not free just because no invoice for it exists. and the average year's true profit shrinks from £2 10 shillings down to 10 shillings. In a good year, true profit comes to £2 15 shillings, once your own wage is properly subtracted rather than quietly absorbed into profit, the way an amateur bookkeeper might let it slide. On paper, before that correction, this forge appeared to return something close to 90% a year on the money it cost to open. That return exists in full only because its owner priced his own labor at exactly zero. The moment you pay yourself what a journeyman earns, the miracle mostly evaporates. A bad year removes the cushion entirely. Revenue falls to £7, while your costs barely bend at all. The apprentice still has to eat, and he eats at famine prices if the bad year happens to coincide with the kind of drought we saw devastate East Meon's customers. The cash box finishes 15 shillings short, and that's before you've even counted the unpaid wage you were owed for your own year of work at the fire. Turn the screw one more time. Set the apprentice's upkeep at that study's midpoint instead of its low end, the more realistic figure rather than the most generous one, and even the average year, not just the bad one, tips over into an outright loss. The margin between a solid, respectable living in this trade and quietly working for free turns out to be exactly one hungry teenager wide. So, could you get rich? Not from one hearth and your own two arms. Not from skill alone, however good you became with that hammer, however many years you put into the craft. The numbers simply don't support it, no matter how you arrange them. But someone in this trade clearly did get rich, and his story tells you exactly where the ceiling actually was. John Payne, a London armourer, died holding property across 5 counties, a scale of wealth no village smith working a single hearth could ever plausibly reach through repair work alone. His fortune came from retailing other craftsmen's work, rather than only his own, from multiple specialisms operated under one roof, from civic connections built over decades, from property investment, and from extending credit to others, rather than only receiving it himself. He was an armourer, not a village smith, a different tier of the trade entirely. But even for him, craft work alone never made him wealthy. His wealth arrived specifically on the day the hammer stopped being the only thing in his shop earning money, and everything else he'd built around it started earning alongside it. Look back at the shop one final time, and this time look at it without any of the movie lighting we opened this story with. A medieval blacksmith shop was never the town's weapons store. It was the maintenance department for an entire wooden world. Part supplier, part roadside service station, part scrapyard, all operating under one smoky roof, keeping every plough, cart and mill within walking distance, running on a schedule that were itself set, not the smith. Its owner's fortune, in almost every documented case, was decided before the fire was ever lit for the first time. Decided in the wording of a contract, not in the skill of a hand. Back at that table in East Meon, one last time. 22 shillings of iron sitting across from 8 shillings of skill. Everything, from the very first line of this story to the very last, depended on which side of that ledger carried your name. The hammer was never the business, the contract was. Comment below. Do you think the smiths who signed contracts like Morden's in 1346 understood exactly what they were betting on? Or were they just following the only kind of deal anyone in their village had ever offered them? Type yes or no. Send this to one person who still pictures a blacksmith making swords for knights. It might change how they see every skilled trade story happening right now, including the ones in their own industry. Next week, I'll show you a seized workshop inventory from a London armourer dated decades after Cripps, proof that the same debt trap was still closing on skilled craftsmen generations later, and that almost nothing about it had changed.